Welcome to Strategikon. Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Following on from the June 23rd Prigozhin Mutiny, we check in to see what Strategikon regular Rod Miller's hyper-realist perspective says about the mutiny and how this will affect Putin and Russia over the coming days and months ahead. Also with us is Strategikon co-host David Olney and producer Michael Magali. Good morning, gentlemen, and a very good morning to you, Rod, out there in the frosty early morning moors of the UK.
Yeah, it's not frosty, it's the middle of summer.
Well, you know, it's frosty down here, so...
It's all right, man. We figured if we've got winter here, it can't be warmer there. What's it actually like there tonight? Like, what's the temperature there tonight?
Give me a second. Phone, do not fail me now.
See, Michael, we make the best editing jobs for you, don't we?
It's 13 degrees.
Oh, so it's warmer there than here. That's bizarre.
Oh, well,
my mother called me the other day. She's in Harare, and she's wrapped up in 4 blankets, and she's freezing. I said, "What's the temperature there?" 24 degrees.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah, that's a difference.
Yep.
Sorry, you're going to have to cut all that.
We digress. It's okay.
Okay. So let me kick things off by asking the general question to anyone who wants to answer it. So is Prigozhin dead man walking?
Who wants to answer that first?
See, this is the thing. All the evidence would say no.
God, for once, Rod and I agree. It's miraculous.
And the fact that it's no opens a huge panoply of questions. And I've been listening to all the reasonable and well-informed people I could get hold of, and there is no coherence in their assessments. And it sort of pretty much hit where I was. It was like, some things going on here that we're not getting. We got a cover sheet, and there's a whole different script underneath it.
Yep.
As to the question, if you're going to get to it, is Putin in a better position? Putin's won this hands down, and Putin's secure.
Okay, well, let's do 2 parts of that. Let's take why Prigozhin's not dead first, because I actually think that's really interesting. If we look at Putin's inner circle, the 2 people with the most military power in his circle are the 2 people with the least military experience, Prigozhin and Shoigu. So interestingly, he doesn't give the people who are ex-KGB or Interior Ministry Special Forces access to the shooters. They get other roles. He gave the caterer and the accountant the most military control, assuming these guys would always be hyper loyal. And I think as a consequence of that, you can beat it up in a minute if you want to, Rod, that's fine.
Yeah, no, go for it.
But I think the significant thing here is Prigozhin has been trusted since 2014 to go and do the dirty tricks and to be utterly brutal. And the interesting thing is he went to Moscow to get rid of Shoigu and to take control of the Russian military because they're utterly incompetent. He made it very clear in everything he said this wasn't anti-Putin. And I think that was true for now. At the end of the day, Prigozhin is an ultra-nationalist and probably wanted to gauge whether he could get this support to take over with the ultra-nationalists, but at the very least, he thought he could probably get rid of his greatest rival for military control, and he wanted to avoid having Wagner end up under Kremlin control as of July 1, and that's going to be the problem. I think under that cover sheet we've got that tells us what's not going on is a horrible deadline of July 1 when all the other private military companies come under Kremlin control, and we watch lots of very rich, powerful people lose direct control over private armies.
Yeah. Shoigu is, he ran the Russian equivalent of FEMA. I can't think what the Australian equivalent is. The sort of emergency
management agency. Yep.
Yeah. And apparently he was brilliant there. He fixed everything that was wrong with it. He kicked out everybody who was stealing. He got the oligarchs out, and he seems to have been the only one who be able to do that before before we put sanctions on and helped Putin get rid of the oligarchs. And then he got given the army, and his job seems to be go through and cut the rot. That's his job. Apparently he's really very well respected. I looked at the guy, and I looked at Western commentary about him, and for ages I got the impression he was a gormless idiot. He was a yes man, and he's not. No, this is the brains. This is
But not again. It's that crazy thing. He's trusted because he's really talented, but not military. In the same way, Prigozhin is really dangerous, but doesn't have the institutional knowledge of the KGB guys.
Yeah.
So if Prigozhin and Shoigu had found a way to work together and trust each other and stand back to back, that would be unstoppable.
There is a lot of talking that the Ukrainians / the Brits got to Prigozhin. And at this point, Ukrainian intelligence and British intelligence, that's a distinction without a difference, if you ask me. I don't know how true it is. I mean, there's so many sort of hints and whiffs, and it's just, yeah, we're missing a lot.
Yeah, but I think the thing that to add to that is Prigozhin is the only one of the inner circle who has actually consistently been in Ukraine watching his troops go out day in, day out. And he's now been in roles like that, literally since 2014, including the utter destruction of cities and whole populations, in Syria that are, genocide, basically. So Prigozhin is the closest thing that inner circle's got to the real deal of the horror or exhilaration of violence, depending on what kind of freak he really is.
On the spectrum of Russian leaders, though, many people look at Stalin as being the geopolitical monster of, well, one of the geopolitical monsters of last century, but certainly the geopolitical monster of the Soviet Union. There's been a lot said about Putin wanting to be like Stalin, emulating Stalin. But of course, Putin is a much more reduced figure. He's more like a Tony Soprano as opposed to a genocidal maniac. So in order for him to keep himself alive against, Prigozhin's ultranationalism, is it that Prigozhin as an ultranationalist is the kind of wet dream that many Russians who, dream of a renewed Russian empire and all the glory that goes with it, they're really craving for? I mean, does Prigozhin fulfill a deep-seated role among some of the elites in the Kremlin in terms of, delivering the great Russia, whereas Putin never could?
Right from the beginning, I've been telling you, Putin and Lavrov, and now I would add to it Shoigu and Gerasimov. These are the moderates in the room, right? You have a hierarchy. Okay, first thing first, the liberals who we fund are nobodies. They're not in the conversation. Navalny appears to be a genuine crook, and that's why Putin gets to put him in jail. And he seems to be so corrupt that we managed to get him on side, which, I don't know definitely that's true, but that's pretty much the narrative I hear everywhere that I go looking. The real opposition in Russia, the hierarchy goes Putin, Shoigu, Lavrov in particular, and Gerasimov, they're the moderates. You have some hardline nationalists in government who want to basically knock heads in, but they don't want to build the Soviet Union, because they all think the Soviet Union was a cost to Russia. Then you have the true opposition, which is the Soviets, the ex-communists, who are now ultra-nationalists as well as being communists, as well as being Orthodox Christian fundamentalists, all in one, called communists. And then you have the real ultranationalists at the far end, the heavies, the people who would like to go to Berlin and then maybe go to Paris and then maybe go to London and then maybe go to Washington, right? Those people have to be kept as far away from politics as possible. And it's a gradation all the way down to Putin, who is the closest thing we're going to ever get to a nice liberal, moderate Democrat in Russia in my lifetime.
Yeah,
That's an
once
irony.
again, it's wild to agree with Rod. And the person I'd add into that mix is I think this is where Prigozhin is such an interesting person. He makes sense to the organized crime bit of Russia that ran Russia in the 90s, who don't care less about the big structure, they care about Russia. But he's also an ultra-nationalist, so he's one of the few figures that could be a lightning rod for bringing organized crime in the traditional 90s sense and different flavors of the ultra-nationalists together, which is why really the fact that he seems to have been loyal to Putin until very recently, if he's lost his loyalty at all, but he is also incredibly dangerous because he's one of the only figures that everyone could agree to use to get rid of the moderates.
Okay, look, can I just butt in here for a second? And I'd like to say that following on from Putin's very angry television appearance on state TV in Russia, following on from the coup, his anger was palpable. I think that this is the first time that we got to see the real Putin, you know, the unscripted Putin going a little bit off the rails because he was genuinely concerned for his own job. But now with Prigozhin having been put into exile in neighboring Belarus, is it possible, and again, it's just a thought bubble here, but is it possible that by keeping Prigozhin alive and yet weakened, Putin allows Prigozhin's network to continue going for as long as they can until one of them slips up, and then Putin conducts a purge of his inner circle and reconsolidates power? And it may not be something that will happen quickly, but surely over the next, say, 4 weeks, we'll start seeing that sort of dynamic. The one thing that's always struck me about Putin is he's not one for forgiving betrayal. And like a mafia boss, you know, it's like, you cross me, I kill you, you know, that sort of mentality. And I think that we'll see this, or at least something like this, play out over the coming weeks. Anyone want to have a crack at that?
I'll put a different spin on it. If Rod's, Rod, do you want to go first or you're right waiting?
No, you go first.
Okay, I actually think there's the wild card for Prigozhin now is that this was actually all staged, and that Prigozhin and whatever proportion of Wagner who go to Belarus with him is actually Putin's way of making sure Belarus is stable. He's going to put a hard man and 10,000 people the hard man trusts in to guarantee that Belarus stays on the right side of the line.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think there's at least a 49% chance this was all a staged game by Putin and Prigozhin, and a way to make sure that Belarus is going to be a stable place and that they can't be white-anted. And Prigozhin will be resurrected when he's seen to bring Belarus into line.
That may be what has been decided, but I don't think that started it. Putin is a terrible actor, a terrible liar, which is why he doesn't lie very much.
Yeah, why he just keeps telling the truth, because otherwise, it shows through. Yeah.
And he was white with rage.
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it. That was not a happy man. Now, we don't know why he was white with rage. Maybe this is something that was going on in the background and nobody bothered to tell him because he'd say no. Who knows?
Or was he white with rage because Shoigu and Gerasimov didn't respond the way they were meant to?
I don't know. The other thing is, the only person who seems to have talked out loudly saying, no, the most important person who seems to have talked out loudly saying, don't do this, is Surovikin. Surovikin, otherwise known as General Armageddon, is Prigozhin's boss, but he's also the guy really running the war. He was formally in charge while Gerasimov went to build the next army. Gerasimov, who outranks him, came back, got the job, went to the top of the food chain. But everything I've seen so far is Surovikin still running it. And Surovikin this is not a man who looks scared. He looked scared and he looked pissed off with what was happening with Prigozhin. Now, maybe he's a better actor. Maybe it is performance. Because my first instinct is this is all, there'd been such a build-up. It'd been so obvious this was coming.
Yeah, it was
And
staged so the West would pay attention. It was like, hello, idiots, something's happening and we want you to follow the script.
So it looked like kabuki theater.
Yeah.
But you have people who are very bad actors showing their rage, which to me screams that it's not theater.
Which makes it even stranger than to send Prigozhin to Belarus. And the practical side of this too is how many thousand people aren't going to sign the loyalty oath and are going to go to Belarus with him. That's going to give us a clue of what happens next. Because if it is 10,000 dudes, that then guarantees that Lukashenko and his regime stay upright. Russia gets the benefit of keeping Ukraine destabilized by having to have plenty of people looking in that direction. This all ends up being massively advantageous. Even if it was a mess that's been salvaged, it certainly seems something's been salvaged.
Just for our listeners, sorry, Rod, the fate of Wagner is now taking a three-way path. Now, I mean, taking into consideration there was an announcement that Wagner is now going to be handing its heavy military equipment over to the Russian army. It looks as though you can sort of break up this whole thing into a three-way path. You've got the Wagner fighters who can flee into exile with their old commander. They can then they can disarm and disappear into the Russian community, or they can be reintegrated into the Russian army or integrated into the Russian army. Neither of these things look good for Putin, because hardened Wagner fighters joining their boss in Belarus seems like a recipe for another tilt at Moscow. Wagner fighters disarming and disappearing into Russia might give them some ideas about politics they might not otherwise have had, stirring a complacent Russian population into political action against Putin. And I really can't imagine that Wagner fighters and Russian conscripts are a good trouble-free mix on the battlefield, especially if Shoigu and Gerasimov retain their positions. I mean, after all, old resentments die hard, right?
There's an option that's not really being discussed, which is, so now Prigozhin is, to all the world, Putin's enemy. And he's going to have, my reading of the numbers is between 4,000 and 8,000. 8,000 is the number of people who went with him into Russia, but a good number of them will claim we thought we were just being moved to barracks and we didn't know what was going on. So they go off to Lukashenko, who is Prigozhin's friend, apparently. And then they go to Africa. And then they go and do the mean and nasty things they've already been doing, but on a bigger scale, for Russia, for China, for the Africans against France and Britain, and in particular America.
Which is certainly the job they've been doing, and doing it stunningly well. And now you're moving out the most hardened people. And what a way to rebuild. Like, either way, either in Belarus they are rearmed immediately and they stabilize the regime, or they are rearmed, do some training time, and deploy straight away from Belarus across the Sahel, and literally create utter havoc for Western intelligence, and try and get China back in the economic game of having enough customers. Yeah.
But there's a big problem in that only one officer, and then Wagner doesn't have an officer corps like we would understand it. But of the people who you could identify as officers, only one went with Prigozhin. The rest is all rank and file. So I don't know if they have all the things they would need to pull off.
Or do we just incorporate the Belarus sort of internal security officer corps in? Because again, they're all psycho, they've all brutalized their own population, and they all like cash. So I don't think there's any real problems getting an appropriate group of thugs with more education.
And really, if those Wagner members in Belarus really want to have new heavy equipment, they'll just purloin it from the Belarusian army, which is pretty much next to useless as a fighting force anyway, right?
So this is the compromise of taking the internal security mechanism in Belarus and head kickers and seeing what you can build together.
There's a factor also to keep in mind with Belarus. Is there's effectively 50,000 Russian soldiers in or around Belarus who will be the stiff back if something happens to Lukashenko. And like I said last time, Belarus is Russia now.
Yeah.
It's legally independent. That gives it all sorts of leeway and makes it useful in lots of different ways to everybody, including the West. But it's Russia.
Yeah.
And the fact that Lukashenko's got him, that's only possible because Putin says yes.
Yeah.
You know, there's another aspect, and I know that this probably will fall outside of the ballpark of this conversation, but with regard to Lukashenko, prior to the war, he was someone who would deal with the West when he wanted to, deal with the Russians. He was always under some form of control from Russia, but he was afforded a degree of sovereignty based on the fact that he was useful to Putin, and he was useful to Putin because sometimes he could also act as a conduit to the West for technology, so on and so forth, and various other business deals. But you mentioned, Roderick, something that was actually quite true, and put this in the mix, and that is Lukashenko and Prigozhin are old mates. Now, could it be that this Lukashenko-derived initiative by getting Prigozhin into exile has the effect of actually putting a little bit of distance between Lukashenko and Putin? I mean, you've got an armed group that, yes, is surrounded by Russian forces within Belarus. I don't deny that 1 minute. But you've got a really powerful armed group now, arguably more powerful than the Russian army, sitting within Belarus. This gives Prigozhin the power base he needs to either work alongside Lukashenko in order to maintain Belarusian sovereignty, or at least retain some of it against Putin, while at the same time garnering the forces necessary for his next tilt against Moscow. And this time round, he's got to really go after Putin. The one thing that I thought was very strange about this whole Prigozhin mutiny was the fact that, when Prigozhin went on TV, he didn't mention Putin by name. When Putin went on TV, as incandescent as he was, he never mentioned Prigozhin by name. And therein lies a very interesting relationship as well, because those two guys go back quite some time. And even though the relationship is breaking down, I couldn't help but think, after everything had been said, that there is still those ties of camaraderie and friendship that they are reluctantly having to walk away from in order to see each other as actual mortal enemies to each other. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
There's something we all could be missing out, because we're all focused on the geopolitics and the military conditions and so on. Putin is apparently really ridiculously loyal to his friends.
Yep.
And Prigozhin is not a military man. He has no military training. He's been doing nasty stuff for a while, but he hasn't had to see, some estimates put it ridiculous, like 25,000, but it's more likely something like 10,000 of his guys killed or wounded right there in front of him. Like nobody else, except maybe Surovikin. He has been there on the ground, on the floor with his soldiers all day, every day.
Yeah.
And a guy who's a petty criminal turned chef turned businessman with no background in this, maybe legitimately his brain went pop.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of this. He is traumatized by what he's done and what he's seen.
Yeah.
And Rod, can you remember the name of the guy that runs the National Guard, the 30,000 troops that basically guard Putin? He was an ex-Spetsnaz guy. I think he was only ever a sergeant. And again, he is the other person in that absolute loyalty category.
It's not a name I've come across.
See, that's the thing. He is the other person that is absolutely trusted and loyal. He's the other part of that group. And we don't hear boo, and yet he's got 30,000 troops.
Yeah.
So Putin is still surrounded by someone he absolutely trusts and 30,000 troops that that person trusts. So the idea you can get to Putin and take him out is a delusional Western idea.
Well, between Prigozhin and between the border and Moscow was a 17-hour drive and 750,000 troops. And all that happened was a handful of planes were shot out of the sky, for which everybody's enraged.
Yeah.
If Putin had said, kill them all,
They
would
would have
all
been dead. And that's what makes this so weird. And at no point did we see or have any evidence of the National Guard mobilizing under the other person that Putin genuinely seems to trust and look after.
Which is, it's that kind of thing that makes us think kabuki theater, but it's also
Yeah.
the kind of thing that might make it think that these are friends seeing one of theirs go off the reservation
Yeah.
because he's broken.
Yeah.
And
Which means find a solution. Don't break him anymore, just find a solution. Or if they have to put him down later if he can't come back, that's different. But they're trying to give him a path back. And this idea of Prigozhin sitting in, Belarus, plotting how he's going to take, Moscow. No, I just don't think that's on the table. I don't think Prigozhin's a pit bull.
Yeah,
and he
he's
might
not
have
that
been
stupid.
he was trying to work out what allies he could get for an ultra-nationalist future Russia. But he's not going to try and seize power. He doesn't have the wherewithal. He doesn't have the support network. And he knows if he pulls shit like that, he is going to be up against the moderates and the National Guard. And at that point, Wagner Group become a grease spot.
Well, the longer Prigozhin stays alive, though, the more likely and the more interesting things really get, because it gives him more room to maneuver, more space to negotiate behind the scenes. I mean, isn't it in Putin's interest to just eliminate him?
No. Bring him back in the fold because he's a hard, loyal bastard and point him back at the appropriate target to regain inner circle status. Like any good dog, you don't kill it when all you have to do is hit it once.
Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. Putin is no Stalin. I mean, Stalin would have gotten rid of Prigozhin. He was an upstart. End of story. Doesn't matter how good he is on the battlefield.
No, that's not true, because Stalin tolerated people like Beria, who was an absolute madman. If you were as psycho as him and loyal, everything was groovy.
The other thing is, let's be honest, Stalin was simultaneously brilliant and out of his league. If the Nazis hadn't invaded, he would have lost. He would have been deposed. And you can't say like, oh, Stalin did these. This is demonstration of the role model, because Stalin's screwing up left, right, and center.
Yeah.
And there's, unlike Putin, there's an epic industrial amount of vodka going down the drain with that one.
Whereas Putin's sane, relatively speaking, and makes a lot less mistakes and is better at genuinely connecting with people. Like when Stalin died, everyone sat and watched and went, please die, please die, please die, please die. Putin seems to have a proper inner circle of people who care for him because he cares for them.
I mean, like I said earlier in one of our previous ones, Putin's looking to retire. Stalin would never have been able to retire.
Yeah.
There's no way Stalin could have got away with retiring.
Yeah.
Isn't it weird, Rod, that we're agreeing on at least 75% of stuff today? It's truly odd, isn't it?
It just takes a military putsch in Russia for this to happen, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I can say. Yeah. You're listening to Strategikon, a Sage International podcast, and from the UK, we're speaking to our regular hyper-realist guest, Roderick Miller, on the Prigozhin Mutiny. Okay, so let's return to Wagner's overseas operations. So as the not-so-hidden hand of the Russian International Dirty Tricks Brigade, now that Putin declared that Wagner was funded by the Russian treasury, Moscow's plausible deniability re Wagner is blown completely. Don't they now not only just own Wagner, but all of this organization's atrocities as well? Is this not a legal conundrum for Putin?
It's legal tidying up, because technically Wagner can't exist in Russia. And the 4 provinces that voted to join Russia were incorporated into Russia, which made Wagner illegal.
Mhm.
And it's only because they were being useful and killing people that they weren't closed down on day one.
Mm.
If it had been peace, the minute the results of the referendum were in, Wagner would have been marched into the barracks, told to hand over their guns and go bugger off.
Mm.
Um,
A bit like
there is a reason.
Blackwater, they'll have a new name by Friday.
Yeah. This is another thing we forget about Putin. We make such a fuss about his KGB background. He's a lawyer who thinks in a very lawyerly sense, and he's an economist. And he's a KGB, yada yada. The lawyer in him is going, well, Wagner exists to bend the rules.
Mm.
If they're in Russia, they break the rules.
Mm.
So we got to get rid of them.
Mm.
So will it be a bifurcated structure where you'll have a watered down version of Wagner Mark II running around in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, whereas you'll have the same old Wagner players doing their thing in various parts of the global south as we currently see them?
Well, they've never stopped doing their thing. So it's been bifurcated literally since February last year. So all we're doing is solving the legal problem. And again, change the name if you need to by Friday. See, the other critical thing, I think this is signaling for, well, Saturday, the 1st of July, that, hey, dum-dums, if you don't sign your military companies over to the Kremlin on Saturday, I'll do the same thing to all of you.
Okay.
So either get your guys under my banner, or I will take away all your toys and all your people, not just your control over them.
How is this actually playing? How's this playing out with? Sorry, how's this playing out with regard to the war? I mean, you know, there is a Ukrainian counteroffensive happening as all of this drama is playing out behind Russian lines. Now, this must have some sort of impact on defensive maneuvers by the Russians. I mean, we understand that Russia has been spending much of the northern winter fortifying its possessions in Ukraine, and those fortifications are giving the Ukrainians hell right now. But the longer this sort of situation in Russia plays out, does this give the Ukrainian military any sort of advantage? Or are you thinking that Ukraine will continue suffering the slings and arrows of Russia's defensive fortifications, lose way too many men to make this counteroffensive even effective, and the Russians can play out whatever political issues they need to sort out and stabilize the situation there?
The Ukrainians are, I think, the chief reason why a lot of people think it's kabuki theater. Because it must be 6 weeks ago, Prigozhin said, oh, we're pulling out of Bakhmut, we've had enough. And the Ukrainians went, oh, well, we can make a comeback. And they sent more guys in, and they all got killed. And it was a trap. Or it was Prigozhin losing his head, and the Russians using it as a trap, which is 6 of one and half a dozen of another. Look, the Ukrainians, the first 12 days, they lost 10,000 men. They haven't got through the line of contact. They've still got miles to go to get to the first entrenched positions, and then they got to get through 3 entrenched positions. This should have been called off 10 days ago. And they changed their tactics. They went from some idiot's idea of an assault and breakthrough and then infiltrate through the breakage to, right, let's go with light infantry. And they had about 3 days of good work with the light infantry stuff, which appeared to be a trap.
I'm reminded of that comic that you sent me, Roderick, maybe about the same time as the counteroffensive started. And that was of NATO and the United States beating on Ukraine to commence the counteroffensive, which has been a long time coming. And now that they've done what their Western backers have asked of them, they're running into all sorts of problems because it seems that they needed far more time to try to work out a way in which they could breach Russian defenses to actually get to the Russian soldiers who are so far behind the lines of mines and Dragon's Teeth and various other fortifications that it's going to take them quite some time to get through.
Look, the Ukrainians lost because Americans don't have enough factories.
Well, and the
At the end
Ukrainians
of it.
don't have enough bodies. Put the two things together,
And the
and they're
Ukrainians don't have
stuffed.
enough bodies.
Yeah.
And the British seem to be only really good at sneaky, dodgy stuff and no sort of old school military capacity. And what applies to the British applies 3, 4, 5, 7-fold to the rest of NATO. I mean, aside from the Turks, nobody in NATO, including the Americans, can fight a technicalized, industrialized war.
Everyone's
Turks can only
forgotten
do it.
how.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, the only people in the world who can do it are the Russians and maybe the Chinese.
And in a sense, the Russians have just settled in over winter for, okay, you come forward, we kill you. You come forward, we kill you. We'll just sit here. So they've really gone back to their preferred way of doing things. And those are right. If we can't push forward into you, you want your country back. We'd be stupid to do anything other than cut you down as you try and get it back. The Russians can do what they're doing now for years.
So where are we with China?
Oh, they're in the deep shit, but that's a whole other story.
Well, it's not
Depends
really
on-
because there are a lot of people who have been saying that, oh, China's watching all of this. China are learning lessons about how to manage the war based on what's going on in Russia. I don't think that they'd be too pleased to see Russia starting to peel off to a very unexpected side politically, as has happened since the Prigozhin Mutiny. So what lessons do you think that Xi Jinping and the CCP are actually learning from all of this?
You're
You wanna
assuming
go
Xi
first?
can learn lessons.
Nah.
Xi wants Taiwan. He's basically scooped the brain out of everyone around him and made sure he's surrounded by people who say yes. The Americans now have to send top tier people just to get human intelligence to find out if anyone can make decisions without talking to Xi. So nothing's changed. Xi wants Taiwan, and in the end, he may be forced to do something about that because he's got so much economic decline at home. He's got so many demographic problems. Interesting numbers came out this week from sort of credible China analysts that youth unemployment has hit 20% in a country that's meant to be the workshop for the world. Sorry, you aren't the workshop for the world when you've got youth unemployment of 20%. So the internal problems are huge, but he'll do something if he wants to anyway. Sorry, Roderick, you go.
I can't speak to that. I would say 3 big things. Pretty much everybody in the world, especially the Chinese, and behind them, the Indians and the South Africans, know Russia falls, they're next on the platter. So nobody's going to do anything to sabotage the Russians. They might be having the willies at the moment to go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. But they might also be looking at it and going, is this all theater like we are? The second thing is, I think in the case of Taiwan, look, the obvious thing is they just got to wait for an election, because the ruling separatists at the moment are losing badly. They're losing credibility, and the Kuomintang are going to win, and the Kuomintang are going to go back and rejoin with China. Unless there's a color revolution in Taiwan to prevent it happening, or some fortified elections,
or a combo
Taiwan
of
and
those
China,
two,
or a combination of those two. Taiwan and China will be one country again. It won't do anything to solve China's deep problems, but it will satiate a certain appetite amongst the population looking at those problems.
Well, it'll
But
be a
if
good
you look-
distraction. Blood and circus.
And
Their
what of?
demographic crisis.
Sorry,
No,
go
you
ahead.
go. I was just.
I
gonna
was
say,
just. Oh. Bloody hell! I hate Zoom. All right. So I was going to say, what about Russia's periphery at the moment, it doesn't seem particularly good. I mean, we're starting to see fighting again between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Kazakhstan's looking a bit shaky. The various other stans are kind of looking east and west towards Turkey.
Looking west far more than east. Again,
yeah,
you
well,
just
are.
hit the nail on the head, and that is
Yeah.
Turkey are being really busy, and Erdogan's win proves that 80% inflation don't mean much.
Yeah.
When someone is driving forward in a way where enough people can go, is it going to be democratic? No. Is it getting better? Yes. Has this guy got a plan? Yes. Is everything improving? Yes. The Turks are just making hay while the sun shines at the moment and doing it very, very well.
And it's ethnicity that really is the ties that bind in the Turkic world, and faith. Yes, yes,
that combo.
I'm going to say faith and language above ethnicity.
Yeah,
but
Turkic language, because culturally they are so different. But the language and faith, and the Armenians really should just migrate very soon.
The Armenia-Azerbaijan thing, I can never remember which one's which, but
Azerbaijan is the Muslim one that's
near the Caspian,
highly related to Turkey.
What I meant,
huge amounts of oil.
Is Russia is allied to one and wants to be allied to the other, and they can't drop the one because it plays really badly at home, and they've just got to basically knock their two heads together. But with all of these things, they all know, all their governments, all their ruling elites, all their aristocracy know, if the Russians fall, they're next on the platter. They will be eaten by the West, by the Western globalists without Russian protection. And so I think you've got 20, 30 years for these things to play out. The thing with Turkey, Erdogan has been riding the tiger from the day he got into being the mayor of Istanbul. Was it Istanbul or Ankara?
Yeah, Istanbul.
He's going to die riding the tiger.
Yep.
Probably in his sleep.
Yep.
And God knows what happens thereafter. But I think fundamentally Turkey is now and will be for a generation in the pro-Russian camp. They will stay in NATO and they'll make noises, and they'll all pretend, and then they'll tell the Russians everything they want, that the Russians want to know. Not that I think NATO's got much of a life left.
Really? How so?
Well, because I don't think Europe economically has got a future unless some radical changes, and those radical changes include killing off the EU and killing off NATO. I think
that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, I reckon so.
But I think we're a couple years from having to make a decision between Russia and China and America. And I don't see us, I think Hungary, Austria, Serbia, they'll be the first to go. And then it'll be a domino. It'll be slow, it'll be gradual, it'll be painful. We will go bankrupt. But America doesn't give us money. America takes money. And Russia and China are offering us trade. And all that's standing in the way is fear of America and racism towards the rest. Amongst our ruling elites.
I could see Britain moving further into the China camp as a hedge against the United States and their neoliberal capitalist ways. I don't know whether or not Britain and Russia will ever be able to mend fences. I think Britain, as you rightly pointed out earlier, Britain and its intelligence services are pretty much indistinguishable from those of Ukraine. And if the money is on the cards that Putin is a very vengeful figure, and any other Russian leader that were to succeed Putin is also a vengeful figure, they're not going to be looking toward London as a nice place.
I am talking about a very, very gradual process. And I do think at the end of the day, the very western end of Europe might exist outside of Russian hegemony, but to do so, it's going to have to break out of American hegemony, which is probably going to collapse anyway. If you have another Biden administration, which is the most likely thing, there may not be an America.
Well, there'll
I
be
mean,
an
he's-
America, but it will be an America as decrepit as the president.
There may be two Americas, is what I'm saying.
What,
Well,
a MAGA America versus a Biden America? Ugh,
I don't know. I don't know. I
perish
mean,
the thought.
this man is so bad at his job, and he is so good at staying in his job.
well, he's had years of practice of being a half-ass in the Senate.
Oh yeah.
Isn't he just a meat puppet though for other interests?
Yeah, well,
Well, that's part of what keeps
you've
him
got
there.
the baby
Yeah.
Obamas, people like Blinken,
Yeah.
who still
Yeah.
believe in the Kumbaya story and
Mm.
still have the arrogance to believe they can make it happen.
Mm. So what
But
does
again-
that mean? Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
Just to jump back, again, this is the thing. Ukraine is going to be a great place to see who's willing to learn lessons, who thinks you can export war and violence and the scary and keep living in the pretendy cosmopolitan bubble. And I guess that's the thing in Europe that's going to potentially tear it apart, is there's people who are realizing the cosmopolitan bubble is exactly that, incredibly fragile and shrinking. And there's people who are going, I want to stay in the bubble, I want to stay in the bubble. You can stay in the bubble right into the point where it implodes and you disappear into a black hole. That's almost inevitable now, that either wake up or implode. And it's going to be country by country or party by party or faction by faction across Europe. And what they create out of that is anyone's guess. The only thing I would sort of say to that analysis, Roderick, of which direction Europe looks, is Europe capable, and again, from your experience of growing up in Africa, is Europe capable of looking south and recognizing if it woke up and became functional and worked with African countries as partners, that combination could be unstoppable? Or is it just beyond the failed empire, post-colonial mindset?
The only people capable of it are the ones who had empires.
Okay.
Britain, France, Portugal, maybe Holland. But also the other thing is, I'm an African. I love Africa. Africa's got the demographics, but we don't have the rivers. We are never going to be the world's industrial heartland because we don't have the rivers.
No, but if you've got the
No.
resources and you can send them to Europe where you've got the factories, and the Europeans just accept that young Africans come to Europe and work for 10 years, get good jobs, go home with a bag of money to build a nice house and have a nice semi-retired life. That combo could be outstanding for both continents if people could imagine what's possible.
In Britain, that was kind of sold as the narrative for the last 15 years. Actually, no, for the last 50 years. But it was always dislocated from truth.
Yeah, it was a great story and a crap application of the story. Yeah.
And it's the same as Germany and the Turks.
Yeah.
Two problems are that the Turks didn't want to go home and the Africans didn't want to go home. And, the handful of us who were white Africans would go back in a heartbeat because our lives in Africa were better. But, the reality is that world is also dead.
Yeah.
The vast majority of Africans I know here have no intention of ever going back permanently.
No, but the point is the Europeans demographically are also dying out in most countries, and you need a replacement young, motivated population. Like Australia, the future is not being pasty-faced and Christian.
Yeah.
The future is being multicolored and different.
The problem is, between us and the people we want are Muslims, and we don't want them. If Europe does convert to Islam, which was what's his name, Ben Lewis, I think Ben Lewis was one of the great Orientalists, who basically said the question is whether Islam becomes European or Europe becomes Islamic. That's inevitable. But the resistance to that inevitability is massive. I mean, it's just like China will eventually become Christian. It is an inevitability. It's just probably not in the lifetime of my grandkids.
But again,
in the Chinese case,
that thing with Europe, again, the point is Africa is such a mix of Muslim and Christian, and that is going to be the biggest migrant stream for Europe. So really its future is turbulent for decades. Like you said, this is a 20 to 30 year minimum, ripple of different forces trying to play out. and see if anyone can build stability or success into it, where Ukraine is just currently this armed camp where the Europeans are testing out waking up. And what we're seeing is most Europeans can't and won't wake up.
Don't you also
There is
have another thing? Oh, sorry, Roderick. Sorry. Don't you also? Oh, go on.
You go.
Don't you also have another issue here? And that issue is, for Europe to succeed in Africa, China and Russia has to fail. So therefore, Chinese economic interests will have to basically pack up and go elsewhere. Russian business and military interests also have to be completely uprooted. There won't be the likes of Wagner crossing the Sahel and doing the nasty.
Yes, there will, because who the hell wants the Sahel? No one but the French or the Russians. It's all about sub-Saharan Africa, and the Chinese have offended so many people. If you go in and offer a better deal with a little bit of respect and a decent timeline, you know, I deal with Africans on a weekly basis, and they would change direction in a heartbeat.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Ironically enough, my master's thesis, the last half of it, is on this question. I just do not believe, as long as we are tethered to Hillary Clinton's America, as long as we are tethered to Hillary Clinton's America, we have no chance of having a proper grown-up relationship with anywhere in the world, particularly Africa. If we get independence, if Trump gives us independence, which is, I think, likely, in that he'll go, we don't want to look after you anymore, bugger off.
Don't care, go away. Yeah.
Then we might grow up. But it also requires purging our civil service. Now, the French are in a better position, but there was always this conundrum at the end of the colonial moment where it looked like it made sense for the French to suddenly do business with the English-speaking parts of Africa and ignore the French parts, and the British to do
And vice
the
versa.
reverse.
Yeah.
And the British did quite well doing that in places, in particular, like Rwanda. But then Tony Blair screwed that up. And the French were never very good at it.
To bring this full circle, listeners, what all this leads to is Wagner, or whatever it gets called as of Saturday, the 1st of July, is going to be so busy in Africa finding alternate ways to pull money into the Russian coffers that in the short to medium term, Putin's got his alternate cash stream, and whoever runs it, Prigozhin or someone else, it's going to be better run now to flow money directly back into Putin's war chest.
Okay.
The interesting thing is, I was going to say, there was a thing 2 weeks ago. The Americans estimated Russia was only spending 3% of its GDP on the war. Like, they're fighting this war on the cheap.
Okay, there's a break here, so I'm going to intervene. Look, I just want to say, to wrap things up, I'm going to pose a question to both of you. Rod, you can go first. David, after. What are your best predictions for how things are going to work themselves out in Russia over the next fortnight? What do you see as the most likely outcomes? So, Roderick.
Nothing changes is the most likely. Next, after that, Prigozhin gets a bullet in the back of his head. After that, very small chance that there's a new revolution and Putin is driven from power. But we're talking about 90% nothing changes. 9.99999% Prigozhin gets a bullet in the back of his head, and an infinitesimally small chance that the Americans get their wet dream.
David.
Similar but different. I think the most likely thing is things stay as they are, but I think July 1 is really important in that we see if the other private military companies come under Kremlin control, and if they do, Putin's in a stronger position, and I think Prigozhin will be given a chance to redeem himself because of friendship and loyalty. If on July 1, on the other hand, the ultra-nationalists and the private military companies go, if we go into the Kremlin now, we lose decades of this poorly run war, if that's how they really perceive it. And, not being the Russia we want to be. So I think July 1 either consolidates Putin very strongly or could be the beginning of a genuine shift to an infinitely scarier, more difficult to understand and manage Russia that will be the ultimate combination of Russian imperialism and the Russian gangster state rolled together with no mediating forces of having studied law or studied economics.
Oh, God. Well, anyway, on that depressing note, that's a wrap. My thanks to our special guest, Roderick Miller, for being on Strategikon at an unholy hour of the morning. Rod. My thanks also to co-host David Olney for his contributions and to producer Michael Magali, who will be soon very busy on the cutting room floor editing this very soon. And to our audience, thanks for listening. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International site, sageinternational.com.au, by hitting the drop-down menu and clicking podcasts. Also, please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. All your likes and subscriptions will help the algorithm find us and bump us up the social media rankings. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni. You've been listening to Strategikon, a podcast of Sage International in Adelaide, South Australia.